Thanks, David. Thanks, Ardith. We're chugging our way through Ecclesiastes. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 this week. Technically, I should probably have preached the sermon I'm about to preach today last week. But I had to finish up that passage first before I could dive into this Ecclesiastes, the rest of 10. It's now a week and a half since the election. Week and a half. Crazy. Time flies. All sorts of things are hopping. Some people think they're hopping in a great direction. Other people think they're hopping in a horrible direction. But they're hopping one way or the other. When I was preparing this sermon, I had no idea what the result of the election was going to be. Because I prepare my sermons at least a week and a half in advance. And so I was preparing this sermon praying, God, I don't know what the election is going to be. But hey, work as you always work. I just knew that the result would be contentious. And just so happens, that a little over 50% of the nation is thrilled. A little less than 50% of the nation is terrified. A little over 50% is ecstatic. A little less than 50% are thinking, how can I move to Switzerland? And the question is, no matter which side of the aisle we're on, what does it look like moving forward? What does it look like? How do we act distinctively Christian in this new era under this new regime? And you say, but he was president, over 4 years ago. It's a new regime. He's got a new vice president, new cabinet complete. It's new. It's new. How do we act distinctively Christian? You might say, it'll be easy. Well, you just give away your politics right there. You might say, it's going to be so difficult. But my question isn't, how do we act distinctively Republican? Or how do we act distinctively Democrat? That's when we start saying it'll be easy or difficult. My question is, how do we act distinctively Christian now? I had a friend. I still have this friend, thankfully. I had a friend who, I was talking to him before the election, and we were talking about the what-ifs. What if this candidate gets in office? What if that candidate gets in office? All that sort of fun stuff to talk about. And he looked at me and he said, you know what? And he gave away his politics at this point in time. He said, you know what? When Joe Biden was president, I shared the gospel so much more than when Donald Trump was president. He said, to my shame. Because when Donald Trump was president, I got into this thinking that everything was okay in the world. And then when Joe Biden became president, he got into thinking like everything's horrible in the world. But the world never changed between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The world is still the world. And there are people who are lost who need Jesus. But he got into thinking that his hope was in the president instead of in Jesus Christ. How do we act distinctively Christian? No matter who is in office, we as Christians have a task to fulfill and a character to exemplify. No matter who is in office, we have a task to fulfill and a character to exemplify. Solomon in our passage today in Ecclesiastes 10 speaks of this, but he uses the terms the wise person and the foolish person, but he's already defined those terms for us. The wise person is the one who fears God, and the fool is the one who does not fear God. The wise person is the one who follows the one true God, and the fool is the one who does not follow the one true God. So let's read what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Verses 4 to 20. If a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, the sort of error that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy the low ones. I have seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves. Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them. If the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success. If a snake bites before it is charmed, the charmer receives no fee. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. At the beginning of their words are folly. At the end they are wicked madness, and fools multiply words. No one knows what's coming. Who can tell someone else what will happen after them? The toil of fools wearies them. They do not know the way to town. Woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at a proper time, for strength, not for drunkenness. Through laziness the rafters sag. Because of idle hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter. Wine makes life merry, and money is the answer for everything. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. This is a group of proverbs that Solomon wrote, but proverbs that carry a central thread going all the way through them, though sometimes we read them and we kind of scratch our head because we forget the central thread that's going through it. But in this passage, Solomon shares a DNA of government and a wise response to that DNA. Before we dive in, will you pray with me? Father, thank you for being the God who hears us and the God who cares. That you're not just this God over someplace else, but you're the God who is with us, intimately involved in us, leading us on our journey until we finally see you face to face. I'm grateful for that you are the God we can trust because you've proven yourself trustworthy. Lord, as I'm up here, Father, as we study your word, I pray that we would understand it and that our lives would change because of it. And as I'm up here, Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart will be acceptable in your sight, my rock and my redeemer. And I pray that I would decrease and that you would increase. Thanks, Father. Amen. Solomon in this passage discusses the DNA of government. But before we talk about what Solomon says, I need to fill in one little teeny tiny point that he didn't really talk about in this passage. The first point of the DNA of governments is that governments are placed by God. This is a point that I've talked about over and over and over the past couple months because it's important to keep in the forefront of our mind, especially during election time. Governments are placed by God. Paul writes in Romans chapter 13, verse 1. He says, "Let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." Now, Paul, when he is writing this letter to the church at Rome, was living under a dictator, a guy by the name of Nero. Interesting guy, Nero was. Nero used to capture Christians just because he felt like it, and he would pour oil on them and light them on fire and use them while they're still alive and use them as human torches to light up the streets of Rome. Wouldn't you like to have him as your friend? Crazy guy. And Paul writes this about his government. Nero exists because he's been established there by God, Paul says. And why in the world would Paul write that? How could he write that? You'd think, Paul, come on. This guy is a horrible man who doesn't care about the sanctity of life, who doesn't care about the one true God, who's doing everything he can to thwart all of this. Why would you say this? Well, Paul would, if he was here and we asked him, he would look at us and say, well, it's because it's true. God establishes governments. God is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He is the one who brings rulers to power, and he's the one who removes rulers of power. But why, Paul? If God is this God who does good things, why in the world would he bring someone like Nero into office? Well, Paul continues to write in Romans chapter 13, verse 4. He says, "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good." But Nero doesn't seem that way, Paul. "But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." Even if they're the most wicked person in the world, even though they curse God, they are still God's servants to reward good and to punish evil. They may not do it the way we want them to, but sometimes God brings a really wicked ruler or a really immature ruler into power in order to judge a nation. Isaiah writes this, Isaiah 3, 4-5, "For I will make mere youths their officials. Children will rule over them." Your ruler, Israel, is going to be the most immature person in the world, and they're going to act like it. How would you like to have a 2-year-old as your king? But some adults act like 2-year-olds. And we don't like it. People will oppress each other because of this. Man against man, neighbor against neighbor. The young will rise up against the old, the nobody against the honored. Judgment passage. This is a judgment passage that God is saying through Isaiah to the people of Israel that their judgment is going to be the king that is over them. Governments are placed by God, and he has a reason for putting them there. We might say, "God, why do we have this ruler?" He says there is a reason. I've put him there for a purpose. For a purpose. Governments are placed by God. But even though governments are placed by God, they are still filled with sinful humanity. No one who has ever been on a throne has ever been perfect. Even if they're staffed by the most godly, righteous people we can think of, it's still filled by sinful humanity. Most of the time, we can look at our government in the United States, and I've had conversations with people like this, and they say, "Oh yeah, it's a no-brainer. Our government's filled with sinful people. We need to drain that thar swamp." I brought in that southern slang. Normally people around here don't say that thar, but I just had to. Everyone knows it's sinful. Drain that swamp. Unfortunately, it's a swamp because it's filled with humans. And if every single one of us was elected to Congress, and the Congress was just made up of us, it would still be a swamp. Because we are sinful people who do sinful things no matter who we are. Solomon looks at the government, and mind you, he is the king of Israel. He is the government. And he points out in this passage that humans, government officials, promote folly. He's standing up and holding his hand up high and say, "Yeah, government, that's me," Solomon's saying. "I promote folly." Though his nation would probably say, "He's a righteous guy." Solomon writes this in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verses 5-7. Ecclesiastes 10, 5-7. He says, "There is an evil I've seen under the sun, the sort of error that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy the low ones. I've seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves." The thing with humanity, we too easily do not follow God. In fact, not only do we not follow God, but we create our own gods because they make sense to us. Sometimes these gods are deities that we make up out of thin air, and we say, "We want to follow this one because it makes sense to me." Or these are appetites and desires that we just want to fulfill, and we just want to eat all we can and have all the sensual pleasure we can have, and that's our gods because we want to follow that. Sometimes our gods are other people, their views and applause, and it makes us feel good because everyone looks up to us. Sometimes the God is ourselves and our pride, and we just want to look after number one and make sure I am right. Whatever the gods are, these are the gods that dictate what a ruler will do and who a ruler will promote. Left to our own sinful desires, our own gods, we will always promote folly rather than wisdom. As humanity, it's what we will because we refuse to follow the one true God and we follow everything else. and brings folly instead of wisdom. Folly's easier. I'll stand up here and say yes. Folly is so much easier than wisdom. And in the moment, we can convince ourselves to think that folly is actually wise because our mind is clouded because we're not following the one true God and we're following all these other things. And we think, this is wise. It must be wise. And everyone else is looking at us and saying, why in the world would you make that decision? It is so clear that wisdom's actually this. But when we say, no, God, I don't want to follow you. I'm going to follow all these other stuff. It swaps, and we think wisdom is folly, and folly is wisdom. It's part of the DNA of government to promote folly. It's part of the DNA of government to speak foolishness. To speak foolishness. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verses 12 to 14, Ecclesiastes writes, words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. At the beginning of their words are folly, and at the end they are wicked madness. Fools multiply words. No one knows what is coming. Who can tell someone else what will happen after them? Warren Wiersbe, a guy who studied this passage, points out 4 characteristics of the words of a fool. The fool speaks destructive words. The words not only that hurt others, but as Solomon says, it destroys the person who speaks them. Solomon in Proverbs talks about destructive words being like weapons of war that create havoc with the person who wields them. James in the New Testament says words are like a fire or a poisonous beast that turn back and consume the person that used them. Not only does the fool speak destructive words, but the fool speaks unreasonable words. He says these are like wicked madness. Jewish writer Shalom Alachman says, you can tell when a fool speaks. He grinds much and produces little. It's true. Fool speaks uncontrolled words. He keeps speaking and speaking and speaking and speaking, not knowing when to stop, but just keeps going and going and going, not realizing that for all the words that he is spewing out, he has said absolutely nothing. Don't talk about politicians right now. The fool speaks boastful words. The fool speaks boastful words. It speaks of the future in this passage as though they know about it or they know how they can control it, but they don't. Only God does. So often these characteristics of destructive words, unreasonable words, uncontrolled words, boastful words are things that we look at the government and we say, yeah, that's them. That's it. I can name the person. We won't. That's because it's part of the DNA of the government. No matter who is in the position, these are the types of words they speak. And you can look at me and say, wow, Pastor Peter, you're sounding really cynical about government right now. Yeah, it's true. Not only do governments promote folly and speak foolishness, but they live for sloth. They do. They live for sloth. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes 10, 15 to 17, the toil of fools wearies them. They don't know the way to town. Woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth and whose princes eat at a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. The rulers, Solomon says, most of them that he sees care only about eating all you can, enjoying all you can, getting all you can. That's all the rulers care about. They're totally indifferent to the responsibilities of their office or the needs of the people. Governments. Woodrow Wilson, former president of the United States, he's dead now, but he wrote, a friend of mine says that every man who takes office in Washington either grows or swells. When I give a man an office, I watch him carefully to see whether he is swelling or growing. And he was 100 years ago. You say, not much has changed, huh? There's a difference between people who use office and who hold an office. And we see a lot of people who use an office because, you know what? It's in the DNA of government. Governments are made of humans. They're placed there by God, but it's full of humans who promote folly, speak foolishness, and live for sloth. And it's the truth. Now, we as humans, for some strange reason, even though governments are made up of sinful human people, and we all nod our head and say, yep, that's the truth, and we can have our own stories that prove it's the truth, still, for some strange, odd reason, put our hope in the government, in a human. And so when elections come up, we say, oh, this is the man we want in office because he's going to do something. He's going to change it. Finally, everything I've longed for and dreamed for is going to happen because of this man. And we try to find satisfaction in that guy or that gal. And then they take office, and 10 months later, we start complaining again. Sometimes it's 6. Because we put our trust and our satisfaction in the government when it's made of sinful human people who promote folly, who speak foolishness, and live for sloth. And nothing's going to change it because it's humanity. So instead of finding our satisfaction in an election, the wise have a different response. The wise have a response of steadfastness. Steadfastness. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 4, he says, if a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great offenses to rest. As humans, we don't like it when people are angry at us. We don't. We don't like serving under despots, unruly leaders, people who do things that we don't like and they seem to be doing things against us. But the wise don't let that stop them. The wise look beyond what is happening now and they look towards what could happen. What is God doing? God has placed the people in authority for a reason. So what is God doing, and how can I help the position on the path that they're supposed to go? How do we do that? I think about a guy by the name of Martin Niemöller. It's a strange story. His name's been passed a lot around lately. Unfortunately, people who have been passed his name around a lot have not shared the whole story. So if you've watched some things or read some things, there's more to the story. He was a contemporary to a guy by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was living in Germany during the time of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Now, after the war, Martin Niemöller, he survived the war. He traveled around a lot and apologized for how he behaved at the beginning when Adolf Hitler started to come to power. And there's a quote of his that's been quoted in lots of different ways because he doesn't have an exact quote. He actually changed it through all these different expansions. But he basically said, when they came for the Jews, I was silent. And when they came for the communists, I was silent. And when they came for the poor and the Africans, I was silent. And then when they came for the Christians, there was no one left to stand up for us. He wished he had done more at the beginning than what he did at the end. He was a theological leader in Germany, and he should have stood up against the Holocaust, but he didn't. Until 1933. And in 1933, he started standing up. He was one of Adolf Hitler's theological advisors. Adolf Hitler wouldn't have called him a friend, but he was someone that Adolf Hitler used and would listen to during the early part of his reign in Germany. And in 1933, Martin Niemöller came to his senses. And he walked up to Adolf Hitler and to his face told Adolf Hitler that what he is doing is wrong. Said, don't do it. You got to stop it. Of course, Adolf Hitler didn't listen to him. But for the next 4 years, Martin Niemöller was still a free man, was still one of Adolf Hitler's theological advisors. And over 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 again, Martin Niemöller would go up to Adolf Hitler and say, what you're doing is ungodly, what you're doing is against Jesus Christ, what you're doing is against humanity, you need to stop what you're doing, Adolf Hitler. 4 years, over and over and over and over again. He didn't resign his post. He said, I'm going to use this post to tell this man that he needs to repent. Well, Adolf Hitler didn't repent, and in 1937 got tired and threw Martin Niemöller into a concentration camp, where he stayed the rest of the war until he was released in 1945. But Martin Niemöller said, God has placed me here for a purpose. I did wrong at the beginning, but I'm going to change, and I'm going to stand against this guy. The wise say, I will stay where I am as long as God allows me to, so I can preach truth, so I can love well, even if the ruler doesn't like me, even if I don't like him. I'm going to stay and use my position, whatever it is, for the purpose of the gospel. Unfortunately, instead of thinking about God's mission so often, we tend to think about our desires and our dreams, our comfort, so to speak. And we say, I don't like this guy. I don't want anything to do with him. I'm going to drop him like a hot potato, and I'm going to go and do this other thing. But the wise looks beyond the now and hangs on steadfastly and says, what can I do today to speak truth, to love well, to share the gospel, and push the people around me, those in my sphere of influence, to know him? The wise not only have a response of steadfastness, but the wise have a response of constraint. They have a response of constraint. We could talk about the last clause in verse 4 where it says, calmness can lay great offenses to rest, which is a great verse. And boy, we could all use a lot of calmness in our lives. And if America would have a lot more calmness, wonders would happen. It's amazing how well water puts out fires and how badly oil does. Calmness does great things. But even more than calmness is what is found in verse 12. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. Someone can be very mean in a calm way. We can be. I've known people who are extremely calm, but are incredibly mean. The wise aren't just calm, but the wise are gracious. In our society today, we have forgotten what it means to be gracious. We've forgotten what it means to be gracious with those who disagree with us, with those we don't like. We've forgotten that. Jesus said this in Luke chapter 6, verse 28. He says, bless those who curse you and pray for those who mistreat you. How often do you hear people when they're looking at someone that they desperately do not agree with, and they look at that person where it's face to face, or maybe it's on the TV screen and they're sitting in their armchair and they're talking back at the person on the TV screen, whatever it is, and they look at that person that they desperately disagree with, and they say, I hope that you live a long time, that you are the wealthiest person in the world, and you have a large family that follows in your footsteps. We might hear someone who says that sarcastically, but do we hear someone who says that like truthfully, from the bottom of their heart, saying that about someone that they disagree with desperately? We don't. But the wise show constraint. When we want to yell, and we want to scream, and we want to curse, we are to be calm, and we are to bless. Proverbs 25 says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. I mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer earlier as a contemporary of Martin Niemöller. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, also a theologian, he was thrown into prison for his faith because he, earlier than Martin Niemöller, stood up and said, hey, Adolf Hitler, what you're doing is wrong. And he did it rather caustically and in the face, and Adolf Hitler said, I'm not going to listen to you, threw him in a concentration camp. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was ultimately hanged there before the war ended because of everything he did against Adolf Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this when he was in prison, when he was in concentration camp. He said, this is the supreme command. Through the medium of prayer, we go to our persecutors, we stand by their side, and we plead to God for them. What does that look like in a government of people that we may not like? In the next election, when there's people we don't like, who are afraid what they're going to do to us, what does it look like to go to our persecutors, people we disagree with, stand by their side, and plead that God would bless them? Dr. Vilmor wrote in 1880, he said, this is 1880, 144 years ago. This command that we should love our enemies and forego revenge will grow even more urgent in the holy struggle which lies before us. The Christians will be hounded from place to place, subjected to physical assault, maltreatment, and death of every kind. We are approaching an age of widespread persecution. Soon the time will come when we shall not fight, not curse, not yell, not scream, not rage, or any other thing that we might put in there. Soon the time will come when we shall pray. It will be a prayer of earnest love for these very sons of perdition who stand around and gaze at us with eyes aflame with hatred and who have perhaps already raised their hands to kill us. Yes, the church, which is really waiting for its Lord and which discerns the signs of the times, must fling itself with its utmost power and the armor of its holy life into this prayer of love. Have we as Christians during this election cycle been known of people who love those we disagree with? The wise have a response of constraint, working for the good of our enemies to the point of praying for their blessing because of the gospel, that they might know Jesus because of us. The wise have a response of maturity. The wise have a response of maturity. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verses 16 to 17. He says, "Woe to the land whose king was a servant and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth, whose princes eat and drink a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Solomon presents this difference in rulers, the foolish ruler, the wise ruler. The fool only feeds his belly, he's only in office to get, to claim, and then there's the wise who's focused on doing good. Now, in Scripture, so many times it uses food as an example for things in life, and because food is incredibly mundane. And whatever we do with food, we're going to do with something else in life. And if we use food just to get fat and drunk, we're going to use everything else in life that way. But if we use food to gain strength that we might do good and accomplish tasks, we're going to look at the rest of life the same way. The wise are mature, and they're focusing on their day, doing good, accomplishing the task, furthering truth. That is maturity, saying, this is my focus. How can I do good today? How can I accomplish the task that God has called me to today? How can I further truth instead of getting sidetracked by all these other things? The wise have a response of maturity. Finally, the wise have a response of patience. Of patience. Solomon writes in verse 20, "Do not revile the king, even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say." Technically, I could have put this verse under the constraint section, and probably should have been, but I didn't want to because I wanted to highlight this. Sometimes we get so fed up with who is in office. We do. I just talked about it. 6-10 months after the election, we'll see what happens. Who knows? We get fed up with who is in office, and we get so fed up that we can't hold back, and we need to let someone know. And we want not just to let one person know, but we want to let the whole world know, because we're so fed up, and the world needs to know that we are fed up, and we think it's right. We think that we deserve to have to be able to voice our opinions. And we live in America, free speech, the ability to assemble, the ability to petition governments, and all of those things are great. We should avail ourselves of those things. But there's a difference between having free speech and petitioning government and peacefully assembling and all these sorts of things and continually complaining. There's a difference. The wise are patient. Instead of continually venting their feelings and disrespecting those that God has placed into office. The wise have a different perspective. They say, God has placed this person in office, and I'm going to be patient, and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to see what God's going to do. Because my faith is in him. My faith is not in government. He's the one who's good. Government doesn't. He's the one who's perfect. Government's not. He's the one who's in control. President isn't. So I'm going to say, okay, God, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to wait. See what we're going to do so I can jump on that train and help it along. And I pray. We use our voice and our breath not to complain, not to gripe, and all these sorts of things. But we use our breath and our voice to pray. Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, he says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people. Not just those we like or those we agree with, all people. For kings and all those in authority, not just those we like or those we agree with, all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Government is going to be government. No matter who is in office, government is going to be government. It's their DNA. How are we going to respond to that? Are we going to live as the wise, or are we going to live as the fool? The only way we can be wise, though, is if we're a follower of Jesus Christ. Left to ourselves, we cannot be steadfast, having constraint, living maturely in patience, because that's not a DNA of a human. It's only found through Jesus Christ that we get to be this way. Otherwise, we will take the foolish route time and time again. So if you don't know him, he died that we might know him and that we might live a different life. Turn to him today and talk to me about it so you can see what it means to join the straight and narrow. But if you have turned to Jesus, remember the path of the wise. This is the path to be distinctively Christian. And don't go even near the path of a fool. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you that you are the God who does something different in our lives. Left to ourselves, you know who we are and what we do. But you come in and you change us that we might be something different. And that we might show the world what it means to be different and to follow you, and that you are the God of love, therefore we show it. You are the God of peace, and therefore we show it. You are the God of joy and hope and endurance and comfort, all these sorts of things. Lord, help us to show it in all areas of life for your honor and your glory until you come again and call us home. Thanks, Father. Amen.